This show is Research with Relevance Friday Features, and this is the fourth show in the midway point of our fall season with shows that will continue to be scheduled throughout early December. The last time we met, we featured Ivan Horin from the Bagwell College of Education, and it was a great show, and he told us about how he teaches students effective research methods using the web tool called Hopscotch. And then he also told us a little bit about his on-campus interactive research methods lab. So just to remind you why we're doing this show, this is for us to stay connected as scholars during this very strange time that we're living in, and for you all to learn about the fantastic research faculty we have here at KSU. A few housekeeping tips before we start. Please make sure that your mics are muted until the end when we open it up from questions from the attendees, and Heather's monitoring that pretty closely. Second, if you want to focus on a particular speaker, and we have two today, you'll want to search for their names and the list of participants and pin them by clicking on the three dots next to their names. And then finally, just to remind you, this episode, as all Research with Relevance shows, are recorded and they will be made available by our office on our YouTube channel sometime over the weekend. And I am getting a little bit of feedback, so I think someone's mic is currently on, if you could check that. Yep, can still hear the feedback, but that's all right. Our schedule for this next hour is to first watch a video, which will feature our guest today, which is Greg Phelan and Heidi Holmes. And then we'll do a live interview with them about their research, where I will start the questioning and then open it up to the attendees. And usually I will say, please use the chat functions if you have that available to you on your computer or your phone to submit a question if you don't want to ask in person. But I actually don't have that capacity on my computer today. So if you do submit in the chat, Heather or Joelle, I'm going to need someone to send that question over to me by my phone, and I can ask, or just feel comfortable just raising your hand and we'll call on you that way. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and, yeah, sorry about that. Let's see, I'm having a little bit of difficulty here. Hang on. No, I cannot find, I've lost my notes. Hi, Andrew, how are you? Andrew, is your mic on? Okay, no, you're muted. Okay, Heather, while I try to find my notes, if you would go ahead and make sure all the mics are muted and go ahead and start the video. Thanks. Why isn't it popping up? I'm coming, Phaedra. I'm coming. We can hear you, Heather.
My name is Greg Phelan, and I'm an assistant professor of economics in the Coles College of Business.
My name is Heidi Holmes, and I'm a visiting professor of economics in the Coles College of Business.
Heidi and I are both new faculty in the Department of Economics, Finance, and Quantitative Analysis. We're also researchers in the Education Economics Center here at Kennesaw State University. The goal of the center is to promote the development, evaluation, and design of sound education policy, as well as further public understanding of education issues in order to maximize student learning and achievement.
We are each working on evaluations of educational programs targeted at groups of disadvantaged students in K-12 and higher education to inform both local and state education policies.
So I've been using data to study education policy for several years. A lot of my research focuses on the economics of education and policies surrounding access to higher education. In particular, I've been interested in policies designed to improve access to college for groups of vulnerable students. This includes a recent program evaluation of the Texas Top 10% Scholarship. This is a scholarship made available to low-income students with high levels of academic ability. Specifically, these are students who graduated in the top decile of their high school classes, but their cost of college attendance exceeded their family's expected ability to pay for college. So I compare students based on their financial eligibility. And what I find is that scholarship-eligible students experienced a 17% reduction in their student loan debt. They were also about 16.5% more likely to have majored in a STEM field 5 years after starting college, where a STEM field would be science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. This is important because Texas, like many states, wants to make sure that students are attaining marketable skills in college while ensuring that those benefits are also affordable.
While Greg focuses on higher education, I focus on K-12 policies. Most of my research focuses on the unintended consequences from various education policies. Since 2000, test-based school accountability policies have spread across the country. While these policies have had some positive impacts on student learning, one unintended consequence has been a decline in culturally enriching field trips. Field trips are a century-old educational tradition. Many of you can likely remember a time when you visited an art museum or a symphony with your school. Such arts experiences expose students to a world beyond what they know and connects them to a diverse and shared cultural history. While many teachers agree that field trips have educational value that's not captured by test scores, many schools have been decreasing the number of field trips in order to have increased time for classroom instruction for tested subjects. My research team and I wanted to use rigorous research techniques to measure the educational benefits, if any, from culturally enriching field trips. In partnership with the Woodruff Art Center here in Atlanta and a neighboring school district, we randomly assigned 4th and 5th grade students to attend 3 arts-based field trips throughout the year or to serve as a control group. We then compared the outcomes between students who attended and did not attend the field trips. We find that students who attended these field trips experienced significant social, emotional, and academic benefits. These students had increased tolerance for people different than themselves, were more engaged in school, less likely to misbehave in class, and even, somewhat to our surprise, scored higher on their end-of-year tests than students who did not attend the field trips.
My results can be related back to a larger concept called intergenerational mobility. 2 important steps for moving people up through socioeconomic strata are decreasing their debt and improving their human capital. The Top 10% Scholarship Program is working towards both of those goals, and I've been able to share my results with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. That way, they can replicate the successful aspects of the scholarship in the future.
As a result of our research, the Woodruff Art Center has continued and expanded their multi-visit program to more students. Additionally, our district partner is committed to continuing to understand the effects of field trips, and we've agreed to follow the sample of students in our study through high school and even into college to see how these students perform and if the outcomes we observe persist.
Great, thank you very much. Come on in, Greg and Heidi. And while you're doing that, I just want to say a big thank you to Tom Boyles in our office who helps us prepare these videos each week. So hi, Heidi and Greg, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I want to ask you, each of you separately about your research, which I think is terribly fascinating to me, but I'm sure to many others that are attending, particularly because the work that you do, which is economics out of Coles, really does have an interdisciplinary flavor in terms of the work that you're doing in Bagwell and in the work that that you can be doing in CODA, for that matter, for the work that you're doing, Heidi. So my first question for you both is, why KSU? You are brand new faculty, and we always like to hear how we have been able to lure such rising stars to our university.
Yeah, for me, it was, Heidi and I are both researchers in the Education Economics Center here at KSU, and that's really what brought me here, was the opportunity to get to work in a center that I can support with my research and that also supports me going back, and has really been a great benefit to me in the year that I've been here.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that Greg said. The being able to work with the center and the faculty associated with the center was a huge draw. And I actually had started working with the Woodruff Art Center prior to coming to KSU. So the opportunity to be closer to the Woodruff Art Center in the district that I'm working with and to have KSU so open for me to continue to do my research was a huge draw out here.
Can you tell me a little bit about the center? So it's called the Education and Economics Center.
Yeah, it's the Education Economics Center. Ben Scafferty is our director, and he's actually on the call. He might be able to give some more details for us.
Yeah, come on down, Ben. Let's hear from you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I came to KSU in 2014 and brought the center with me. And the dean at the time, Kat Schwag, used to joke that the center is just you. And we've grown significantly. We've hired great faculty like Greg, Heidi, and Eric Warren. And we brought in Karen Person to help us with research. And we hope to grow more in the future. We just like using to answer interesting, education policy questions.
All right, Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot. So when you're looking for faculty to affiliate, are you just looking in Coles, or do you, are there opportunities for you to have faculty affiliate from the other colleges?
There are opportunities for faculty from other colleges to affiliate, and send me an email, bscafidi@kennesaw.edu. Happy to talk with you.
Great. All right, well, let's just dive into the research. I find it incredibly fascinating. I'm going to start with you, Greg. I love the work that you've been doing in Texas, because I think the translation to what we have here in Georgia with the Miller and the Hope scholarships is pretty significant. So can you explain to me what or describe to us the difference between the scholarship program that you've been studying in Texas and how it compares to what we have here, and maybe some pros and cons of the types of scholarships in both places?
Yeah, sure. So the scholarship, I should back up a little bit here and say that the scholarship that I'm studying, the Texas Top 10% Scholarship, exists because Texas has this rule called the Texas Top 10% Admissions Rule. And a simplified way of explaining this is just that every student that graduates in the top decile of their high school class in Texas gets automatic admission to any public university that they choose in Texas. And this this admissions program has been around since 1999, but there was no scholarship made available to these students who qualified for admissions using this rule. So while it did a lot to sort of like flatten out the geographic distribution of students who were accepted or college, it didn't make any sort of concession that some of these students might not be able to afford to go to college. And that's where this scholarship came in place. So kind of taking your questions out of order a little bit here, if you want to know about like the benefits of merit-based versus just need-based, well, this is something that accomplishes both, and that there's certainly going to be very bright students who can't afford to go to college, and this kind of helps get them, towards that goal of being able to go to college. As far as it relates to what we do here in Georgia, Georgia has the Hope Scholarship, and then this year, just the recently passed Shirley Miller Scholarship, which is kind of in the same vein of the Top 10% Scholarship. They work a little bit different, but it's a combination of both merit-based and need-based funding for students, and I think it's a great thing, because we should try to channel money to those students who need it the most and also could be the most successful in college as well.
I totally agree. How do you break into either the Department of Education here in Georgia or into the groups that are doing that kind of research here in Georgia, or are your plans to continue to do your research focusing on the Texas scholarship?
Both. So it's funny enough, I have a lot of friends that I went to grad school with, and friends that I made that were also in other schools that ended up getting hired here in Georgia at Georgia State. And then also I still maintain a lot of relationships in Texas. So I've that Texas administrative data that I've been using, but also start to reach out and start to do some projects here, like what I said with that Shirley and Miller scholarship in the future. And then also like things like other expansions of college access in Georgia as well, something like the Hope Accelerated program, where it's giving like a dual credit scholarship for high school students.
Great. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Greg, but I don't want to ignore Heidi for too long. Heidi, I love the research you're doing. Primary data collection within school systems is some of the work that I've been doing also. So I think that that's really outstanding, looking at the impacts to educational outcomes. How is it that you got involved with this? And maybe the video talks about it a little bit, but if you could go into a little bit more detail on how is it that the cultural activities piqued your interest the most? And is this an area that you can continue to do research in, or are you going to move in a different direction?
Yeah, so I first got interested in it. My plan when I was starting out was not to study the impact of field trips. It was kind of new research for me, but what I was interested in was school accountability, and was looking at a lot of different school accountability themes and kind of looking at the unintended consequences that come from high stakes test-based accountability. And one of the areas that is not studied very often in the research is the effect of test-based accountability on kind of extracurricular activities, or kind of the narrowing of a curriculum. And one of those things is a reduction in field trips. So schools take less field trips, and they report it because of pressures due to test-based school accountability. And I thought, well, field trips are like a century-old educational tradition. We've been doing field trips forever. There probably is some value in them. And there's really limited, rigorous research on the social, emotional, as well as academic impacts on field trips. And so that kind of got me interested in it. And then as well as some of my advisors in grad school were studying it, and we had the opportunity. The Woodruff Art Center actually approached us to say, hey, we're starting this new program. We would love to do a rigorous evaluation of it. Would you be willing to help out? So that's how I got started.
And what is the long-term trajectory of your research? I think I heard you say in the video, or when we talked last, about a longitudinal data collection. And has that been funded? And will you expand the research within that longitudinal framework?
Yeah, so it started. So the project I was talking about in the video, we're currently in our 4th year of the project right now. And last year was actually the last year our students received their field trip. So fortunately, on our part, all of our students received treatment before schools closed. So I'm grateful for that. But then we're going to continue to follow these students through. So they received their treatment in elementary school, but we're continuing to follow them through middle school and high school to see if the effects that we found persist, if they eventually kind of disappear, and whether kind of new effects show up. So once they get into high school, where they have more autonomy of choosing their electives, do they choose more arts-based or humanities-based electives when they have the opportunity to do so?
And because we're student-centric, we always ask the question about whether students are engaged in your research. So Greg, I'm going to ask you that question first.
Since I've only been here a year, I haven't had the opportunity to develop that relationship with any students here. I can't say that it's something I'm interested in the future. I know that, my advisors and my mentors certainly invested a lot of time and energy in my development as a scholar. And when I'm ready to take on my own mentees and advisees, I want to make sure that I'm able to provide them with that same level of commitment.
So maybe it's an unfair question for both of you, since you are brand new to KSU, but Heidi, I'm going to ask you the same.
Yeah, so at KSU, I haven't had the opportunity to work with students, but like Greg, I've benefited hugely from mentors. And the whole reason I even wanted to get a PhD and go into research is I had the opportunity to be an undergrad research assistant for one of my professors in political science. And I thought, people can do this for a living? Like, this is a real job. This is amazing. So to have the opportunity to do that would be great. And I think there's a lot of opportunities. We're starting to do more of a qualitative evaluation of the same program, where we have focus groups and interviews with parents and teachers and students. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to involve students in the research.
And I asked you this question before, so I already know the answer, but I asked you if either one of you have been collaborating with faculty in CODA for you, Heidi, or in Bagwell for either one of you. And I think your answer was no. And so I'm hoping we have some of those faculty on and maybe the deans as well. So I do have my chats function now operational on Teams. I don't know where it went or why it came back, but it is working. So if we have some people who are attending who want to send in a question, please feel free to do so now at any time would be great. And while we're waiting for those questions to roll in, I'm just going to keep on going. So this one's for you, Heidi. So I don't know the field of educational economics, but I do watch the news, and I believe I heard in the news last week about Betsy DeVos saying that that the test-based curriculum needs to stay in place, and I think I heard a little bit of pushback from state education departments saying this, because of the pandemic, this is probably the worst time for us to continue along that vein. What are your thoughts about that? Not politically, but just what are the impacts of COVID for kids, particularly around testing?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. It's also really particularly relevant for Georgia, because Georgia had either applied or at least stated that they wanted to apply for a waiver to kind of exempt schools from end of year testing for this next school year. And I think DeVos's statement made it clear that she's saying we're sticking with what law currently is under the Every Student Succeeds Act. States are required to continue to administer state standardized tests. But what she did say is that waivers will be granted, or there's some flexibility on how that actually plays into the state accountability system. So in essence, she's saying, yes, you have to test, but you have some flexibility of how you actually use it in your accountability policy. So does it have to count towards your school grades? Maybe not as much as it has in the past. So there's some flexibility there, and kind of the consequences attached with the testing won't be present this next year. And I think there is some value. So some of my research has kind of been pushing against or showing kind of the unintended consequences of test-based accountability. But that's also not to say that tests don't show us anything valuable, and so in a time of COVID where everything is very different than what it has been, we're unlikely to see, significant gains in test scores, or there's, some unique circumstances in how we administer the test. But testing still during this time can give us some idea of how students are performing, where we're falling short, and help us give a better idea of how this kind of virtual learning is actually working.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to ask you the COVID question, which is, if you're studying field trips, and field trips are virtual now instead of, if at all, they're virtual, what is this an area that you can study? Are there resources available to study this? What do you personally think are the impacts of students not being able to go on in-person field trips?
Yeah, so I think students not being able to go on field trips this year is kind of part of the bigger view of education that students are really missing out on. So part of what we believe kind of are the causal mechanisms from attending field trips to seeing these positive benefits is it connects students to kind of this broader world beyond their school, right? And these kind of connecting experiences help students in a variety of social and academic ways. However, in such kind of a cloistered year, kind of students are isolated in their homes, they're not as connected to the students in their class, their teachers, nor are they kind of having these expanding experiences outside of the traditional curriculum. I do think there is, kind of a broader concern for what students are missing that way. It's also interesting to think of kind of, can field trips be virtual? So this is one area that I would love to study. There's some suggestive evidence in a prior study that I did with some co-authors. We looked at the effects of going to the theater, so students viewing live theater, and then we showed some students a movie to see if the effect was different from just seeing a movie in a classroom to coming to a theater. And we saw that people watching it in a movie didn't experience the same benefits as those viewing a live theater. So there's some evidence that an in-person experience is much better, but there's really limited research, and this is an area I would love to continue studying.
And I can only imagine that the resources are going to be flooding this area, right? Because look what CODA's having to do for all of their students and keeping them engaged in the arts, but having to do it virtually. And there's just so much that we're going to be able to learn during this time. Greg, a question has come in for you. Thank you, Ben. I had this on my mind to ask also, and you phrased it much better than I could. And it says, why is Greg so passionate about access to higher education?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very, poor family. and disadvantaged families. So I didn't have any sort of like or a lot of examples of like how to get into college, how to apply to college, how to get financial aid, which meant that I struggled a lot once I got there. And luckily I found good advisors and good mentors that helped, push me along and invested a lot of time in me. And so I definitely feel the benefit of college because now I'm sitting here as somebody who has earned a PhD. And I think that benefit should be available to as many people as possible, as long as they're willing to work for it.
Thank you. And let me ask you a COVID question, because why not? Do you think there are any impacts on socioeconomically disadvantaged kids applying for scholarships of any kind, merit-based, needs-based, whatever the case may be? I mean, and is there any research on that?
Given how recent COVID is, specifically, is there anything out there right now that says COVID causes less, entrance into college causes more? It's hard to say because there just hasn't been so much time.
It doesn't have to be COVID. It could be any disaster, right?
Exactly. So what I'm getting to, though, is that there is a lot of research out there that talks about how disadvantaged students often, like was my experience, don't actually have a lot of experience just understanding how to apply for college, or understanding, knowing that it's something that's really available to them, or that they have financial aid available to them. And I think in a world where there's students, taking classes online, going to school online for high school, and there's even less interaction with teachers and guidance counselors that way, then I think that does have the potential to put disadvantaged students, poor students, minority students, however you want to think about disadvantaged or vulnerability, at even more of a disadvantage as they try to go to college in this time as well.
Yeah, thank you. Roger, did you have a question? No, okay. I don't, Teams randomly throws people's face up for me to look at, so I wasn't sure if you were going to ask a question or not.
I'm just someone that likes me.
Of course. Are there any other questions from attendees? Feel free to jump in.
Hi, anybody there? Can you hear me?
We are here, yes.
So I have a question. This is Luke Noise, by the way. What about the students who are provided education or entrance to an education and they're not prepared, like low-income minorities that are allowed into Yale or Harvard or something like that, and then they are they can't compete, and had they not, and then they drop out. And I mean, I guess that's the extreme case, Yale and Harvard, but you can imagine the same thing at Kennesaw or anywhere. And it seems to me that there really is this a lot of this stuff happening where the student gets loses confidence and drops out. And so that, I guess I don't know if there's a lot about that out there in research or what can be done or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. So actually in Texas, this is something I was alluding to earlier, is that there has been research by a group of researchers, Rodney Andrews, who was one of my advisors, Mike Levenheim, and Scott Imberman. And they studied a couple programs. One of them was run by UT Austin. The other was run by Texas A&M. And what they found is that following the top 10% admissions program, there were a lot of students that maybe graduated from a poor, disadvantaged high school in like Central Dallas or downtown Dallas, or somewhere like South Texas, Valverde. I'm not trying to pick on either of those places. I'm just using them as examples, that qualified to get into college, and then either weren't going, but then the ones that did were having problems being successful once they're there, and that was because it's one thing to offer admission, it's another thing to offer some other like financial support, but we also have to do a good job once we take students in as well, and giving them the right advising and also the right resources so that they can be successful once they actually get to college as well. So there has been this a lot of research that's looked at this, and the good thing is that it's come up with a lot of programs in a lot of different universities where they're trying to do more counseling for these students that they do believe are at risk.
Great question. Heidi, I do want you to know that Yvonne, who was our guest last time in Bagwell, who runs the Interactive Research Lab, says that they would love to collaborate with you on the qualitative, on the qualitative dimension that you are planning to add to your research. So we have made a research connection. Our job is done.
That's great. I actually watched Yvonne's show 2 weeks ago or whenever it was and made a note of like, oh, hey, I need to look at their resources. So it would be great to talk to you, Yvonne.
Just send me an email whenever you want, and we will be more than glad to collaborate with you two guys. Thank you for sharing with us what you are doing.
It'd be great. Thank you.
So Yvonne, I know Yvonne calls himself a research catalyst. I'm going to start calling myself a research matchmaker. All right, there is another question here. It says, at KSU, I have programs to support. This is from Allie Garofino, who is a research scholar in humanities and social science. She says, at KSU, I have programs to support students who are parents. One of the core components of a two-generation approach to support students who are parents is increasing their social capital. Greg mentioned measuring social capital. How do you define it? And how can we increase the social capital of our student parents?
So I do know what she's talking about. And so I think I actually did mention social capital, but I still think that it's important to look at these, because I do think parents or students that are also parents are often have a lot on their plate, and it makes them vulnerable to a lot of things, because something can happen, a family emergency could happen on the day you have an exam, and then all of a sudden, one missed exam can really throw off a whole semester for somebody. So I do think it's important to provide these programs, and I'm really glad that she has some programs like that. I think the things that I was talking about doing, if I'm talking about moving people up through socioeconomic strata, I think a lot of that is, as it related to my research, was in the reduction of student debt, and then also increasing their human capital, which we saw in the terms of we saw more people majoring in these STEM majors. And I'm not trying to argue that STEM majors are the only employable fields, but there's certainly no lack of job opportunities in STEM fields, especially in a state like Texas that has a lot of engineering and technology focus in their job market.
Other questions that people would like to ask in person? Don't be shy, it's almost the weekend. All right, I'm going to ask about funding. It's my job to encourage you to get external funding. And I think the work that you're doing, Heidi, I think is already funded externally, maybe through your partners from your last university. Do you have plans to go after funding as the PI, and who funds the type of work that you do? You're muted.
I apologize. So the funding for the current project with the Woodruff Art Center, we have a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts. So a federal grant for that to continue on with this project. And then in the future, yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities for further grants from the National Endowment of the Arts, as well as some other larger national foundations. And I think going forward, like I talked about earlier, kind of expanding on this study, there's really a small body of literature on field trips and kind of arts education. And so there's a lot of possible paths to expand going forward.
Greg?
Yeah, so I was just recently given more access to this Texas data to kind of expand this line of research where I'm looking at access to higher education. And what I want to do is study that intersection between expansions of access and also student decision making. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to offer a new program at a university or open a new community college campus or something like that. But those are only good so much as students are actually utilizing that new resource. And the nature of the Texas data allows us to look at decisions like course making or course taking, things on a much finer level of granularity than just did they graduate, did they not graduate, and what did they major in, which is great because a lot of these sort of like when I talk about human capital, a lot of the sort of human capital benefits or the human capital gaining happens actually in the classroom and is dependent on the courses that students are actually taking. And so with that project, my co-authors and I are, we're looking at some Russell Sage Foundation money, and then also some William T. Grant, and then there's also a Greater Texas Foundation also likes to support these things as well.
Great, thank you. So a couple more questions. Greg, this is from Brett, and he says, has Greg thought about using his research to specifically help KSU student success? And I hope that we have our VP for Student Success watching today, and VP of Enrollment, because I think so much of what you do really could help us out here. But what are your thoughts, Greg?
Yeah, I'd love to do research on this specifically that would help target students, because I think a lot of the students that I'm studying in my other research projects really look a lot like the students that we have here at KSU. So I think in some indirect way, the benefits that I'm finding for that and then trying to promote with policymakers in Texas could carry over to Georgia, but I'd absolutely like to specifically look at things and programs here at KSU in the future as well.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Greg, is the scholarship in Texas direct costs, meaning tuition and fees only, or is it the full cost of attendance, which of course is a big problem with scholarships in general, right?
Yeah, so this scholarship is actually it's a $2,000 a year scholarship for up to 4 years. So starting in their freshman year, and then they can renew it up through their senior year. And then in their junior and senior year, if they major in one of these STEM fields because they're deemed a high marketable skill field because of workforce shortages in Texas, then they can get an additional $2,000 for each of those years as well.
Thank you. This question is for you, Heidi. This is from Dean Payne. He says, Dr. Holmes mentions her consideration of people's finite resources such as time, money, and cognitive capacity. As such, has Dr. Holmes found any patterns in the limits in resources and specific college decisions such as distance from home, time, or full-time, money, cognitive capacity, etc.?
Yeah, so, and you may have to correct me if I don't get this full question right, or if I don't answer exactly what you're talking about. So when we're talking about kind of schools have limited resources as far as money and time as to where to allocate their time. And when we're looking at the consequences of test-based accountability, when schools are held accountable for their tests, they devote time and money to more core subjects. And so we've seen time and money spent on kind of arts and education, and specifically field trips, decline over the last 20 years or so. In my research specifically, we haven't looked at any kind of overarching patterns of where this happens most, but other people in the literature have, and what they have found is that schools that face higher accountability pressures, one, tend to be in low performing areas. They feel more pressure to increase their test score, and typically those schools are in lower income areas and educate a high population of minority and economically disadvantaged students. And so what we've also found, and part of the motivation for this research, was that schools are partly there to serve as kind of to equalize access to cultural institutions for lower income and middle income families who may have less access to institutions than higher income families. And there is a kind of well-developed pattern in the research that higher and middle income families are more likely to take their students to kind of art museums, cultural institutions, more than lower income families. So schools are really a place that can kind of provide equitable access, and the students who don't have as much access at home are also in the schools that have cut field trips the most.
Great. Yeah, it was a complex question, and I think you got it. Did I ask you already about dose, or have you answered that yet?
I don't think so.
because in public health, we're always about, is it one-time exercising that's going to make your body fit for life? Unfortunately, the answer is no. So is it one field trip or a field trip every month?
Yeah. So this research, past research and past research I've done with some other colleagues has shown that kind of one field trip has shown short-term benefits. A couple weeks after the intervention, students tend to have some socio-emotional benefits compared to students who didn't attend the field trip. And that was another motivation for this study, is to say, okay, what about continued exposure? So students in our study get 3 different field trips in 1 year, and then a subset of our students participate 2 years in a row. So they get 6 field trips over the course of 2 years. And then our control group actually gets 1 field trip. So we're really estimating the difference between 1 to 3 and 1 to 6 field trips. And I was somewhat hesitant going in thinking, you know what, it's kind of a one-time effect. You're exposed to this broader world and there's not this compounding effect. But we actually have found some evidence to say that actually longer-term exposure increases your desire to consume arts in the future. So students like it. They want to go back, not just with their school, but with their family as well. And that the academic impacts and school engagement impacts actually are strongest once these students have entered middle school. And this is after treatment has stopped. They've stopped receiving these field trips, but we see that they continue to be more engaged through middle school.
Excellent. Here's a question. Through what possible channels would more field trips increase student test scores? Through what channels?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'm always sometimes hesitant when I present this research at first to say, like, hey, guess what? We found that arts field trips increase student test scores, because when we started this, I was probably the most cautious and most hesitant to be like, look, I don't want, sometimes arts advocates, as much as I tend to agree with them and jump on with them, sometimes we have a tendency to say, like, arts are going to do everything. Arts are going to help you read. Arts are going to help with math, where we kind of went in and say, well, like, maybe they don't impact academic skills, but they have a lot of value in kind of these socio-emotional outcomes. But then when we started this research, we thought, okay, we're going to find no effects on academic benefits. You don't have to worry about taking time away from the classroom, but you're not going to have negative effects, but we're probably not going to find positive effects. And then when we got into it, we were finding some of the biggest impacts that we saw on end of school exams. And we were a little shocked at first, but as we start to look at it, we really noticed that student school engagement was going up. They attended school more often, they received fewer disciplinary infractions. They reported that they simply liked school more, they were more engaged, more conscientious when they were doing their tasks. And so we think one possibility is that it's not necessarily field trips providing content that helps them on standardized tests, but they're just more engaged in school. They try more, they like it more, and then they do that also in their tested subjects.
Okay, I'm going to bring this back around to me, sorry, but I do economic impact assessments, right, of public health interventions, and oftentimes that translates to an impact on educational outcomes, just like what you're doing. How do you put a dollar value on improved test scores? How does one put a dollar value on improved test scores?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So there is a lot of research that does this, and I should caveat my response with, I am not an expert at doing this. So there are a lot of papers that do that, and we don't attempt to do that in our paper. So we've actually been asked this a couple times, and we make mention of saying, like, look, providing a more well-rounded or a holistic curriculum may not come at the expense of academic benefits, but it may help them also, which has, we cite other literature, increased academic benefits have all kind of positive impacts. They're more likely to go to college, they're more likely to get better jobs, all of these things. But I think we're really hesitant before we assign that dollar amount. One, because we're multiple steps away from the end impact that creates the monetary value, and because the methods are, we don't have the type of data needed to do those methods on them. And so I think that's kind of a punt on your question, but it's we allude to it, but there's more people more sophisticated than I am.
I'd like to actually jump in here too. I've actually done a lot of research on school accountability in Texas, and I think actually it is a big question, like how do you put a dollar amount on these sort of things on field trips? I haven't done anything specifically on field trips, but I have done things on school accountability. And what I have found in Texas is when schools aren't accountable, there actually are some penalties for these schools. Some of them are decreases in the amount of funding that they get, which is kind of counter, and they don't happen that often, which is lucky. But beyond that, there's also like they have a harder time retaining principals. And if you have a lot of frictions because you have leadership that's constantly rotating and turning out of these schools that are already struggling, then that's also not a good thing. And I think that can also be translated to like, what we think of as a more traditional like economics and dollars, disadvantage for these students as well.
Yeah, the question gets asked all the time. How much is the value of life if you save someone's life? How much is the value of improved cardiovascular health? How much is the value of improved educational outcomes? Returns on investment is the way that our policymakers think. And so the good research that we do, unless we can bring it to that final stage, it's a real challenge. Okay, there's another question that came in that says, two questions came in. One for Heidi, how long does the positive effect of the field trips last in your research?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So we, the results that we have currently are the third year of our study. And so we have data on students 2 years past receiving their field trips. So they received field trips in 4th grade or in 5th grade, and then now they're in 7th grade and we're observing the outcomes. So we see actually 2 years past treatment so far that we see these substantial impacts. And what was really interesting is it wasn't until 2 years past receiving the field trip that things like school discipline really started to pop up, and we saw significant impacts for our treatment students on school discipline. And I'm not saying that field trips didn't have an impact on student discipline, but now students are old enough to be in middle school, and discipline looks very different in middle school than it does in elementary school. And so middle school students are more likely to be sent to the principal's office or written up for an infraction. So we finally had enough data on school engagement to really see these effects, and we see these large effects at least 2 years after treatment now, and we'll see how long they persist in the future.
Okay, finally, I've been waiting for a question from the Dean of the College of the Arts. Dean Pulankala asked the question, how does the disciplinary content of the field trip impact student engagement or outcomes?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And this is one question we've been asked a lot. And in our current research, we can't actually just know the effect of the content of the field trip based off of just receiving the field trips overall. So the field trips in our study, students were able to go to the High Museum of Art, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and then a play by the Alliance Theater. So they received 3 different arts experiences, and we can't detect the difference between the 3 of them as to like if the symphony is better than the art museum or the theater is better than the art. When we ask students, they say they like the theater the most, or at least they're the most positive about viewing the theater. But past research that's been done has looked at just an art museum or just visiting the theater. And similar effects have been found for both of those experiences, as we find in this study. So that is one thing that the research doesn't tell us much about, is does the actual content tell us anything about the impacts, or is one more beneficial than the other? And from my standpoint, I enjoy the arts, but I am not an artist, nor have the ability. And so we've really left it up to our arts partners to say, you know the arts, you know what's best, you design the intervention, and we'll kind of bring the research and education side to it.
So, it's not just the type of discipline, but what about quality?
Yeah, and quality in the research on field trips, there is a lot of research talking about the quality. So specifically in like art museum field trips and arts content in general, so visual arts, there seems to be a difference when like art museums either use volunteers, unpaid volunteers, or they have trained professionals give the lead the field trip for students, or do they provide a on hands activity after, right? Do students get to create the art after seeing art and things like that? And the research is growing in that area, and quality does seem to be a big part of this. And we've been fortunate enough to join with really quality partners. I mean, the Woodruff Art Center is a world-class museum, and the groups that we've done similar research with in Arkansas have also been really high-quality interventions. But there is a possibility that you get a low-quality intervention and you don't see the same benefits.
So, Amy, I'm not going to ask your question because Heidi just answered exactly what she asked about the type of experience and whether kids are let loose in a museum versus actually have a tied content to the visit itself. But I think you just answered that. Any other questions from the attendees? We're coming close to time, and I want to give you one last chance. Okay. Any final words from you, Greg and Heidi?
No, I think this is great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been great. We appreciate everybody's comments and discussion.
And we appreciate your time as well. You know, this is not in anyone's job description to take time out of your very busy weeks. And so we really, really appreciate the time and energy that you've put into this presentation. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and call it. I invite you all to come back in 2 weeks. If I could get to my notes, I would pull them up and tell you who we're going to be featuring, but I just can't seem to find them that quickly. So you'll just have to know it's going to be another outstanding presentation in 2 weeks' time. And so on behalf of the Office of Research, I want to wish everybody a happy and healthy and safe weekend. I think we're going to have some beautiful fall weather, and we deserve it. So go KSU. Thank you so much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.